Bismillahirrahmanirrahim and Assalamu alaikum everyone. Again, this is going to be the last lecture on sort of core micro. I'll follow up with one more lecture that sort of tries to zoom out of the study of markets and talks about Pakistan. Of course, this has been a much more abbreviated look at markets than we had planned. As I've tried to explain to you, it's been taking me a very long time to put each of these presentations together to sufficient quality that I think should be a fair sort of replacement for the lectures that we had and their interactive quality. So we've skipped thing 4 as we've talked about before, but let's move on to thing 5, where Chang is arguing that if we assume the worst about people and we assume them to be greedy and self-interested all the time, that we get bad behavior from them. And I think this is a fairly weak chapter, and I'm going to argue for why that is so. So Chang starts off by this very famous quote from Adam Smith. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. This is a sort of central idea of how economists think about human behavior. We think that the fact that the butcher sort of brings meat to us, or the baker brings bread to us, the brewer not being relevant, is that they are doing it to serve their own purpose, which is to earn money from you. And as long as we allow them to work unencumbered, the fact that we're allowing them to charge a price from you is what gets economic activity going and brings valuable items to the consumer. Now, of course, there are times when we need benevolence from society towards others, and Smith is silent on this. But the core idea that markets aggregate self-interested behavior in a way where suppliers and people who demand their product come together out of selfishness or self-interest leads to a system that satisfies the most wants. This is, of course, hotly debated and has been hotly debated since Smith's time. But the system of capitalism does certainly find its foundation in this idea of markets aggregating self-interested behavior, leading to the best possible outcome. Whether that is so or not obviously depends on things like market failures and inequality and so on that we've talked about before. But Chang then takes a different route to this. Chang says that self-interest is a powerful trait, but it's not our only drive. Now, of course, economists understand this, and behavioral economists over the last 30 or 40 years, 40 or 50 years, have described particular ways in which we lack, that people act in ways that are different from what self-interest would predict. But the problem is that we don't have overarching theories or predictive models that incorporate non-selfish behavior into our core economic models. And so we can't really use this for predictive analysis. I'll come back to this later. Then Chang says that to run an organization, you cannot assume that everyone is out to protect their self-interest at all times. And here Chang is moving away from discussing self-interest, which is something that we covered in, so just to recap, in thing 1 we said that there's no such thing as a free market universally defined, that markets are political. In 2 we said that companies should sometimes not be run in their owner's interest. And in 3 we had talked about tradables, and again restrictions on trade. Chang is now moving to away from markets to talking about self-interest internal to organizations. And so, how do we think about running an organization? Economists tend to divide how we think about um, about this, and in particular, economists tend to prescribe different ideas for managers based on whether or not they can observe workers' output well. Um, so, for managers of hard to measure or immeasurable output, it is wise to cultivate a sense of ownership among the workforce. So workers take actions in the firm's interest. And Chang has this idea of sort of example of a manager from Kobe Steel saying economists basically don't know how to run an organization, and arguing that trusting subordinates to make the right decision and just signing off on their ideas is valuable. We'll come back to Kobe Steel in a second. But first, let's talk about what is hard to measure. So examples of what can be hard to measure include administrators' judgment calls, right? So a judgment call being one where there isn't a perfectly well-defined quantity trade-off between two options. For example, something that's been talked about in the sort of discussions and debates around the LUMS fee hike is this alleged waste of spending by, or of money by spending on fountains and frescoes. But there the counter argument can be that they have thus created aesthetic value. Now the whole debate will hinge on whether the aesthetic value created is worth the money spent, and reasonable people can differ on whether this was worth it or not, right? In other words, you don't have well-defined measure of the value created, and so we leave up to debate this idea of whether the fountains and frescoes were worth the additional money spent. Another thing that's hard to measure is firm reputation and efforts that you undertake to improve brand equity. So, for example, if a customer comes into your store and you spend extra time with them rather than going home, maybe you're charging overtime, and the customer walks away without making an investment, they've still perhaps left with a positive view of your brand. And again, it's very hard to measure that brand equity created, and we can make assumptions and we have ideas around this, but it's still hard to measure. And finally, conducting research. So imagine that you're conducting research into a topic that is where the possibility of making a breakthrough is low, but if you make the breakthrough, the profits will be unimaginably high. Decisions that managers are making and decisions that workers are making in putting in effort are hard for top-level managers to look at. And so there we'll have one type of a solution. Again, we're not talking about principal agent problems here in formal detail, but this idea that you create a culture works better for output that is hard to measure and so on. And so there are two problems that arise. One is that managers can't know who to reward. So if a company's reputation is increasing, all of these small actions that are taken, it's very hard to separate these out and say one was worth more than the other. One action in service of customers or one smile at a welcome desk was worth more than some other action. More importantly, when output is hard to measure, top-level managers can't write contracts that lock down a commitment on their part to pay for the output that is created. So you can't write a contract that says, if you increase the firm's reputation by 10%, I will pay you X. Now, so when output is hard to measure, this idea of cultivating a sense of ownership is valuable. More than 500 companies received metal from the steelmaker that failed to meet agreed on specifications. And Kobe Steel knowingly was found to have falsified data. The chairman and CEO, who is pictured here bowing before a bureaucrat from the Ministry of Industries there, ultimately not just apologized but stepped down along with many of his senior executives. So while the point made in the book that you should cultivate a sense of belonging is fine, this scandal also underlines the importance of good measurement and oversight. And it's arguable that perhaps what the Kobe Steel executive in the book was saying was sound management style, which is to just trust your subordinates, actually really blew up in their faces. So back to running an organization. If output is easy to measure, for example, on an assembly line, blunt incentives may work better. In other words, if you have static nature of work or well-defined task, a piece rate, that is, money where paid by the number of pieces that you output at a given time, can be more effective than an hourly rate because they incentivize people to produce effectively. In other words, taking a break on an hourly rate isn't really measured and is output loss for the firm. But taking a break on a piece rate means that it's coming out of your pocket. So you'll probably want to come back as soon as you're refreshed enough to continue. But because it removes our agency or our control over how we're living, because it is so restrictive, piece rates can feel dehumanizing. Charlie Chaplin had a really fantastic film from 1936 called Modern Times, which looks at, or which is a caricature, as you can see here, of a firm that runs in a very sterile way, lots of sort of machines buzzing around, but without much for the human to do. And perhaps this is the better way to look at this. Right? Chaplin's genius is that he puts forward in one little skit something that is perhaps gets at the gist of the problem. So let's get back to work now. If you're a factory manager, this is a factory in Bangladesh, textile factory in Bangladesh. As you know, Bangladesh has had a major expansion in its textile industry in the last 20 years. The question of should you use an hourly or daily wage or a piece rate to incentivize your workers still stands. If you use the hourly or daily wage, people may end up working as little as they can without inviting consequences. So piece rates are in widespread use, right? If these people were just working on one, let's say, one salary that they're paid, a fixed amount that they're paid per day, they'll work as long as the supervisor is standing on their head, but they might sort of ease off when the supervisor is not looking. Whereas with a piece rate, they're perhaps more incentivized to keep working. But there's a twist, right? There's always a twist. And this brings us back home to Pakistan. As you may recall from Pak studies, there is a large cluster of football manufacturers in Sialkot. This cluster dates back to the late 19th century during British rule and makes between 40 and 60 million balls a year, or 60% of the world's output. This is also, so this cluster, footballs and the cluster is also the subject of one of Pakistan's best known economics research studies of the modern era by Atkins, Chaudhry, Khandelwal and Verhoeven. And if you Google these guys, and I'll share the one of the outputs, they have multiple papers out of this project. If you Google this, you'll come across sort of videos explaining and blogs of explaining the work, and also, of course, their academic work if you're interested. So here's the cluster. And at the time of the study, there were some 135 football manufacturers in the Sialkot cluster. So if you see here in this picture, you've got main Sialkot city, but then towards the left in Samrial, there's an industrial estate, the Sialkot Industrial Estate. Up top is the Sialkot International Airport, and down below you can see the new M11 highway approaching Sialkot. These investments in the airport and the highway have been done in part because of Sialkot's importance in and success in creating valuable exports in Pakistan. And so the question that should interest us is, why do these firms tend to be in a cluster? What's so special about Sialkot that has caused this industry to grow up here? So the researchers were interested in understanding how well innovation spreads as firms adopt technology from one another. One sort of guess as to why this might have sort of emerged here is that Sialkot might have just happened upon the conditions under which the first football manufacturer was set up during the British era. Remember that Sialkot, Lahore, in this region were the outposts, but were still sort of reasonably well-governed colonial subjects, whereas other parts of Pakistan, as you move away from this region, excepting Karachi, of course, were less, perhaps, and to some degree Peshawar, were less rigidly governed. So perhaps there was something that might have been just a few British soldiers who wanted a shoe repaired or a football repaired or what have you, and that first factory emerged here. Over time, though, what would have happened is that by virtue of one firm sprouting up in this region, it would have created the conditions for others to emerge. And so what are those conditions under which you get that greater what are the circumstances under which, or what are the things that first firm has seeded that creates the conditions for new firms to emerge here? There are many ways in which this can work, including benefiting from observation. So your neighbor has put up a football factory and you say, oh, this is great, I should do the same thing. And you adopt that practice, learning by watching. Or you might be buying from common suppliers and so on. If you cross the Ravi out of Lahore towards Shadra, you'll see a lot of cultivation of strawberries there. Strawberries were not a historically grown crop in this region, and then one entrepreneurial farmer decided to try them out, and within years it just caught on like firework. So that's just learning from observation. That's a low-tech view to it. In contrast, if you look at Silicon Valley, you also see a cluster. In Roth's Reinventing the Bazaar, of which I prescribed a few chapters for you to read, there's a chapter in which he talks about the value of clusters in the context of Silicon Valley. And he reports there that at the time, engineers changed jobs every 11 months. So remember, this is an older book from the late 90s or early 2000s or so. And at that time, engineers were changing jobs every 11 months compared to every 3 years in America in aggregate. And because the laws in the region allowed people to go and work for competitors quickly, this meant that what you had learned in one job was easy to port out and try out in a different context and helped spread ideas quickly. So having some firms of a particular type in one place can, under the right conditions, create a cluster around them, create a sprouting around them. Back in Sialkot, the researchers figured out that if they could seed an innovation in some firms, they could observe how it spreads through the rest of the cluster in order to understand technological diffusion and adoption. Unfortunately, I don't have pins for the 135 firms. I don't quite know where the spread is. This red pin that you see near the left forward sports factory is where I believe FIFA or Olympics, I think it's the FIFA balls have been produced in the past by this company. Now, a traditional football is made of 20 hexagons and 12 pentagons, the black shape being the pentagon and the white, of course, being the hexagon. And these are cut from a large sheet of rexine or artificial leather. What the researchers did was they introduced a new cutting pattern um, that sort of that the cutters in the assembly line would follow, and by doing this, and by using dyes, which I'll show you in a second, which sort of a different type of dye that is compatible with this, reduced material wastage by approximately 7% and total cost by about 1%. Now 1% is tiny, but because the industry's average profit margins are just about 8%, if you decrease cost by 1, if you're increasing profits by 1, you can potentially increase profits by 1/8 or 12.5%, right? So this is a pretty significant innovation. If you were told that there's a simple way to improve profits in your firm by 10 or 12%, you'd bite the hand off, right? And so that's what these guys did. Here are dyes that went along with on the left, of course, are the traditional ones, and on the right are the new configuration of dyes that just meant that you were wasting less rexine left in the middle by packing these shapes more tightly. And so in the study, what these guys did was they introduced this technology, the cutting pattern. A cutting pattern, you might think, is not really a technology because it's not like the usual type of technology that we think of, like machinery or software or something. But technology is anything that helps you convert input into output, and this cutting pattern is part of that process, and so it's a technology, right? By introducing this technology to workers, they did this carefully, though. They randomly picked some firms out of the 135 to introduce the technology to, and they didn't introduce the technology to their owners, but only to the workers of the firm. They expected to see diffusion as other firms caught on to this technique and adopted the technology, but only one other firm adopted. And so they went back and conducted interviews, and they learned that the new patterns slow workers down initially so much as they're rebuilding habits and trying to get used to these cutting patterns, that they become fearful because they were being paid piece rates. So they stayed with the old technology because they didn't want that dip in their income, and even lied to owners about the new pattern's efficacy. Now, owners aren't experts at figuring out both the cutting or the time it takes or how much material is lost. But so what these guys were doing in the study is trying to mimic the very many cases in which assembly line workers figure out better ways to do things than they've been told by management. And this has been observed across the board in many places. And so what these guys, by virtue of exogenously bringing in this new technology but only giving it to the low-level workers, wanted to see was whether the worker walks up to the manager and says, "Hey, I found a nice way to do things. Let's adopt my way and see what happens." The reason that workers aren't going to owners and doing it, though, is that it actually leads to it actually punishes them in some sense, right? It means that they are going to make less money this month. So when the research team went back, they offered a 1-month income reward to workers if they successfully demonstrated the benefits of the new technique to owners. And that's all it took. As soon as that happened, the technology was adopted widely in the cluster, and you got a 10% profit improvement there. So in conclusion, the ideas from the study are that piece rates work well in the soccer industry, but there are limitations and exceptions. The limitation being that, or the exception being that someone working on a piece rate is not going to waver from the defined task that you've given them, just because, and they're not really going to care about anything but the piece rate flow. And the other sort of idea is that if we let workers share in the benefits of innovation, that's when they'll come to you and tell you what they've learned. So if the owners had been wise enough or had the foresight to go and say, well, they wouldn't have, because they didn't know the quality of the technology. They wouldn't just speculate. But if they'd had a contract with workers saying, if you show us a new way to do things, we will then pay you extra, that would have worked, you'd think. Except there's another catch to that, which is that in Pakistan, or even indeed elsewhere, there is the problem that if you demonstrate a technology to somebody, they don't need you anymore, right? So it becomes very hard to write an enforceable contract where managers are able to say, if you show me new ways of doing things that are better, I will give you a reward. That becomes hard to enforce. Now, you can do that by announcing this publicly and sort of locking your reputation in this way, but it's very hard to enforce if an owner says in Urdu, "Jao bhag jao," or reneges on the contract more formally, then workers don't really have recourse in this country to anything else. So, what should we assume about people? I think economists, excuse the typo, assume rationality for a draft prediction of human behavior. We have very nice cohesive models that allow us to draw clear prescriptions or descriptions, or predictions is what I meant to say. Economists assume rationality because these models give you good predictions of how humans will behave. But as we've just seen, self-interest can play out in really subtle ways. Behavioral economists and psychologists have mapped out many other motivations, including pro-social preferences, which are preferences that have to do with improving the society generally rather than myself. Public-mindedness, which is similar but perhaps more used in the context of public servants trying to do better for the government. And loss aversion, where we try to avoid loss intensely, even at the expense of our expected profits. So we have all of these, we have a mapping, very extensive mapping of all of the ways, or at least very many ways in which humans can give up self-interest in thinking about how they're going to act next. As self-interest in the narrowly profit-maximizing way that we tend to think about it. The problem, of course, again with this is that we don't yet have intuitive or tractable or easy models of human behavior that incorporate this more complex understanding. We don't have the equivalent of a supply and demand model type of a framework that allows us to say, well, clearly in this context, loss aversion means the following deviation from our first model. So for now, perhaps it's appropriate to use self-interest based models for a first pass over problem, right? So you use your standard econ models, you figure out your predictions, and that's your guesstimate, the first rough pass over the problem. But then review and think about implications of other motivators. So you try to make your prediction more sophisticated, but in a less formal way than you would like. Chang has highlighted the limitations of assuming narrow self-interest all the time, and credit where it's due. But I see this as a limitation to keep in mind, right? Not as a debilitating flaw of economics in the study of firms and markets. So with that, we conclude the 5 lectures that I wanted to give you on Chang. I'm going to end the material on this course with a much more general talk next. I'll see you there.